Welcome to the Otherweb. Our guest today is Jeff Einstein. Jeff is a digital pioneer who created the first how-to book on personal computers and the first digital marketing agency way back in the mid-80s. Recently, he is exploring what he calls the default media addiction, which causes people to sink all their time and money and freedom into digital media.
Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Alex. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. So, you are a digital apostate. What is that?
Digital apostate. Apostate is someone who basically turns against the state religion at some point in life. And I was an early digital media pioneer dating back to around 1984 when I wrote the first major how-to book series called Einstein's Computer Guides. I never touched a personal computer before I signed the book contract, but I knew how to write and I had a great last name. So later on that same year, I co-founded, based on the notoriety from the book series and a couple of endorsement contracts that I was able to secure with major retailers and manufacturers, I co-founded the first digital advertising agency in the nation called Einstein and Sandom Interactive, later on and Einstein and Sandom Inc. So that's my digital pedigree. It goes way back. About 10 years later, in the mid-1990s, we sold the agency to a media conglomerate, DMB&B. I don't even know if they're still around anymore. By the time everybody was getting in the door during the dot-com era of the late 1990s, I was on my way out. I was looking for the exit ramp. I was already beginning to suspect that things weren't going to work out the way everyone was promising. So that's what I became. In the early 21st century, I started writing about what I saw as a meta addiction, the default meta addiction to all things media and all things digital, and started asking the question, what happens to our time, our money, and our freedom and our faith when addiction becomes the rule rather than the exception?
So let's take that word addiction apart a little bit, because there's a lot of people writing about the problems of spending too much time on our devices. Right? Jonathan Haidt just wrote a book about all the mental health issues that arise out of using our devices too much, especially as children. Right? Tristan Harris was warning us for a while now about companies trying to addict us on purpose. How do these two things connect? What is the addiction mechanism?
The addiction mechanism is the same with digital narcotics. It's the same behavioral addictive mechanism that works with any other narcotic. Basically, it preys on the same blood chemistry, and it's a basic risk-reward mechanism that over time replaces the meaningful rituals in our lives, which provide structure and spiritual, social, emotional, and physical mechanisms that protect our well-being. It replaces those meaningful rituals with the rituals of our mindless, what I call mindless rituals, of our obsessions and addictions. That's how people become addicts. Over time, the mindless rituals of their obsessions and addictions, which dictate how we spend our time and our faith and our money, with mindless rituals. And that's how you become addicted. And recovery programs all work the same way. They basically backwards engineer the same process. They reinstitute and reinsert meaningful rituals to replace the mindless rituals that originally replaced the meaningful rituals. That's how they all, regardless of the technique, that's how they all work. They all work on a moment-by-moment interventionary basis to intervene in the addict cycle, the addictive cycle, to reinstitute a meaningful ritual, even if it's only for a few minutes.
All right, so let me play devil's advocate for a second. Even though I agree with many things that you're saying, I want to dig into them and see if what is the second layer, the third layer, etc. When I was a kid, I was growing up in Israel. I spent at least 3 hours every day playing soccer and at least 2 or 3 hours every day reading chess books or doing chess exercises of some sort. Those were my two big meaningful rituals, at least when I'm alone, right? Obviously, there's family rituals, things like that. But for the most part, you could say the bulk of my time outside of school was spent on those two activities. Today, I'm guessing most young people spend their time on social media or playing a video game of some sort, or at some age, porn, right? Those are probably the three big time consumers of adolescents today. How is one more addictive than the other? What is the real difference between those two?
The difference between the two lies in the difference between mindless rituals and meaningful rituals. Meaningful rituals I define as those rituals that contribute to one or more of our four basic needs, and they are in order of satisfaction and importance: spiritual, social, emotional, and physical. So any ritual, if you stop and think about it, every minute of our day virtually is ritualized. Rituals become the roadmaps of our lives on a day-to-day basis. They determine how and when, with who we spend all of our time and money, basically. So the meaningful rituals can include going out and playing soccer, because that contributes most likely to satisfying your social needs, because you're probably not playing alone by yourself. It contributes to your emotional well-being, because the physical activity releases serotonin. It makes everybody feel better, calms everybody down afterwards, and makes you more susceptible for other good things in your life. Mindless rituals have the opposite effect. Mindless rituals are those that we build to protect around our obsessions and addictions, to protect those things in our lives. They become institutions that the obsessions and addictions build around themselves to protect them from the incursion of meaningful rituals and other things that would basically backburner them and put them in the background. Again, that's how all recovery techniques work, how all recovery programs work eventually, to the extent that they work.
So I guess on a chemical level, we're just juxtaposing serotonin with dopamine here?
Yes, pretty much. There's a dopamine release in regards to all things that feel good to us. The difference with addiction is that addiction is, another way of looking at it, addiction is ritualized obsessive compulsive behavior. So when you get in the process, when you get deeper into the process of ritualizing your obsessive compulsive behaviors, you're on the road to rewiring your brain chemistry. Basically, your brain has a plasticity that will conform to any repeated behavior over a protracted period of time. And now that can be a very bad thing when it comes to addictions, but it can also be a very good thing because it also rewards good behavior. So that's the brain basically finding ways to conform to its environment. Sometimes the brain has to shut down certain functions in order for us to survive. So we may find ourselves in very dire circumstances where the limbic systems that provide emotional knee-jerk responses are not particularly healthy or helpful for us, where there are certain situations that may require better contemplated responses than we might otherwise provide through our emotional.
It sounds like the entirety of the modern world.
Pretty much. But that's the entirety of the modern media ecosphere. The media landscape is to create ongoing crises that provoke that part, the emotional limbic responses to what's going on, which is the exact opposite response through electronic media that we used to have through print, because print promoted linear thought and contemplative thought. Basically, it compelled people to write things down and to read them afterwards. And those are quintessential acts of contemplation and organization. The electronic media, and it's no mistake that electronic media came to the fore in the early 20th century with the rise of radio and motion pictures, because it promotes the exact opposite. It doesn't promote linear thought and reason. It promotes emotional response and tribalism and larger-than-life personalities. So guys like Mussolini and Woodrow Wilson and FDR and Stalin and Hitler and Mao were all perfect, big personality strongmen, that they were perfectly attuned to electronic media, because all electronic media, especially digital, works in that capacity.
All right, let me challenge you on that. Were they substantially different from a Napoleon or an Alexander the Great? It seems like larger-than-life personalities arose even before people could read or write, and there was no media, essentially.
Yes. No, in that regard, they're no different. On a personal basis, we've had strong men in every era and in every society, in every empire. Empires are built by strong men and destroyed by strong men, for that matter. So in that regard, there's no difference. What's different is the reach of electronic media is confined not only to people who can read, but to people who can't read. So it's expanded. It's an expanded reach. And my biggest problem with digital technology isn't the extent to which it expands the reach. It's the digital scale, the imperative of the digital scale itself, that in terms of Jonathan Haidt's research and how social media and smartphones and Gene Twenge, is that Twombly? The researcher out of San Diego. They both are talking in terms of digital scale. What happens when the numbers become too big, basically, to monitor, too big to control? What happens when institutions that are already too big to fail suddenly become 5 times larger and 5 times more powerful and 5 times less accountable in the deal? And that's essentially what digital scale did for us as a society at the turn of the 21st century, when it became apparent that the same digital tools of consumerism on the internet, the behavioral targeting and big data, were basically the flip side of the same tools that were being used by dark state agencies, by deep state agencies like the NSA and the CIA. And they were all basically the same digital tools, just being applied, and they're all being applied commercially now. But at the time, it was just a convergence of digital scale and in the hands of people with real concrete agendas. So I often say to people that, the default addiction and too big to fail aren't the unintended consequences of bad plans or failures to plan. They are the plan. These were very much, anticipated and invested in and built to behave the way they're behaving right now.
Except I assume the plan is not to disinform on purpose. The plan is just to make you stick around and watch more ads, right?
Both. I think that the desire, the commercial desire to have you stick around and consume media, do nothing basically but consume media 10 to 15 hours a day. The real intent is to turn you into an addict. That's the real intent of commercial media, is to support the mechanism of addiction. That's why it's there in a consumer society. That's the real intent. That's the end game of a consumer society. It's like Brave New World. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. They realized they didn't have to have a big brother as long as people would control themselves through their own addictions.
Okay, so let me dig into that if you have an independent company like TikTok, let's say. All right, TikTok, bad example. Maybe the Chinese have an agenda. Let's pick an American company like Facebook. Does Facebook care what kind of society they create? Or do they just want to create a user base that keeps consuming more Facebook? And therefore, they make a lot of money. They become very large, very rich. Everybody's happy from their perspective.
I think initially, Facebook's intent was the latter, was to be on everybody's, eventually in everybody's smartphone, but to be on everybody's desktop and to keep people hooked. I think that was the intent. Addiction was the original intent. Later, with the power that came from that technology and came from the addiction and dealing narcotics on that scale, came an agenda, a political agenda. But that's just what happens with power. Power always seeks to exert itself wherever it is and however it arises. It will always seek to assert itself further. It will always seek to become more powerful, and the politics is just one extension of that.
But that seems somewhat inconsistent with the fact. Like, it actually seems like right now Facebook and Instagram and Threads, which are all owned by the same company, are trying to reduce political and reduce news in their platforms because they don't make enough money on that, and it creates too much controversy. On the other hand, smaller companies that don't have as much power are actually emphasizing politics and news because that's what sells. So that is more consistent with the idea that everybody's just chasing dollars here. And even those who acquire more power, sometimes they just want to give up power if it's not good for business.
I agree with you. And I think the only way that they really come to that realization at the end of the day is to have that power and to exercise it politically. At a certain point in time, they incur a certain level of pushback, like Facebook and all the social media guys are now incurring. And they also butt heads with other very powerful institutions like the Congress and other government agencies. And they suddenly realize that the $50 billion that they used, that they invested last year to buy off local, state, municipal, state, and federal agencies to exert themselves and to buy influence is only half as much as they're going to have to pay this year. Every time they piss off a congressman or a senator, the price to buy that congressman or senator goes up.
Okay. So that is why Adam Mosseri is announcing that they will not promote political or news content going forward, right? In your opinion?
I think that they hit a wall, that for now, they've hit a wall, and they realized that the whole practice of joining forces with the government on such a wholesale basis, including the embracing of the agenda of this particular government, has real commercial downsides. And they're doing what they can, trying to toe the line and play both sides of the coin. How successful they'll be moving forward is anybody's guess. But they, most of their contracts now, you look at how Amazon makes its money right now. It doesn't make its money through the retail business. It makes a lot of money through the retail business, but its real bread and butter are government contracts, and cloud services, and servers. They basically work with all the defense, the entire defense establishment, all the intelligence agencies. All of these guys basically are in the business of trading data. Data is the currency. And they're all in the business of trading data. So at a certain point in time, when you reach a certain size, how you exert influence becomes less important than the trading of that data. So whatever it takes in order to move more data, if that means backing off the government or at least the overt government participation, all well and good. If that means basically stepping on the gas and shutting down a few off-colored conversations in the back channels, all well and good. I don't think they care that way. I think it's just, it's a form of arbitration.
Okay, so as you described the symbiosis between large tech companies and government, it sounds like it's unlikely that government will stop the drug dealers in your analogy. So it sounds like we as individuals need to have our own strategy for getting ourselves unhooked from the drug, and maybe public policy, which may or may not come from government, but at least it will affect a large number of people, needs to help people clean themselves up. Let's start from the individual level. What should individuals do for themselves, maybe for their families, to try to clean up our act?
On my Substack, Quality of Life Resistance Movement, I propose it as the antidote to the rise of Huxley, to the rise of this great centralized totalitarian power that's in our lives right now. And there are 3 central calls to action on the Quality of Life Resistance Movement, and they're all geared around the individual, because my realization at a certain point in time was that centralized power and institutional power is so unilaterally applied, right? It's such a one-party town. are institutionally, right now in this country. And that the only way to deal with it basically was from a grassroots movement upward. So there are 3 calls to action in response to your question. The first is to turn away from diversion and focus on those things that we know historically contribute to the quality of life. Those things are faith, family, and community. Focus on those 3 things. The second call to action is to find ways to reintroduce meaningful ritual into your life as a means to modify and moderate your own excessive behaviors. That's specifically in dealing with the addiction side. The third call to action was a return to local autonomy as the only way to deal effectively with top-down central authority is to turn your back to it and deal only with those things in your own backyard, in your own neighborhood. And that may be with, with faith-based organizations. They certainly have to do with the schools, which is why a lot of the recent movement, reclamation movement, is centered around parents right now in school boards. Because parents saw what was happening to their kids during COVID when their kids were at home and the parents were looking over their shoulders and seeing the shit that the kids were looking at, were being fed every day. They said, wait a second, this can't happen anymore. And all of a sudden you have a bunch of parents who previously were happy to hand that over to the school district and the authorities and the experts. And suddenly they're not so sure about that. And they're questioning the expertise, they're questioning the authority, they're questioning the school districts and the elected or appointed bureaucracies therein. So those are the 3 calls to action. If you want to get more specific, I'm happy to get more specific. I have tools on the Substack that address each of those calls to action.
Yeah, I'd be interested to dive into each one, but let's actually start from the last. I saw a statistic recently that micro schools have now eclipsed parochial education, or at least Catholic education specifically. I think it's something like 1.5 million kids now in that system, which is good news, but it's still much, much smaller than public education. Can it ever grow to the scale where it competes with public education? Or if it gets big enough, it will get squashed?
Yes and yes. I think that it doesn't have to become, it doesn't have to challenge the hegemony of public education except to the selection of curricula. So that microeducation, if even at some point in time it becomes 15, 20%, charter schools, if they at some point in big municipal school systems reach the size of 10, 15, 20%, at that point, that's a very meaningful difference because most of those charter schools are located in inner city neighborhoods. They're there to help kids who are trapped in failing schools primarily. And if you it's like just the plantation mentality moved northward is in those schools. They're the most segregated institutions in the country right now are inner city schools. So if you get to 10, 15, 20% of kids who are now trapped in failing schools and you turn their lives around and you say to them, you are no longer consigned to lifelong poverty and distress, generationally, you or your kids moving forward, that makes a big difference. That will make a very profound difference. And then there's going to be another percentage, you use the term micro schools, another percentage of homeschoolers and micro schoolers who will basically opt even farther out because charter schools are still public schools. They still deal with the same dollar. But micro schools and private schooling, homeschooling, and parochial schools and other alternatives will chew up a certain percentage as well. So at the end of the day, if we can get 20, 25, 30% of the public curriculum turned around, then I think you're doing a real service. The public school system is there as an industry to service the adults. It doesn't service the kids anymore. It may have at one point in time. And I think its motivations were much cleaner and much more pristine way back in the 1970s when the Department of Education was first established. Now it's like any other institution. It's old, it's sclerotic, it's fat, it's lazy, it's bureaucratic, and it's only there to protect the interests of the people who run the show.
I think if you read John Taylor Gatto, he will claim that the motivations were kind of questionable since 1851.
Yeah, they were. It was to provide a good drone class, a good working class.
The Volksschoolen, if you use the Prussian word for it. But again, I don't want to dabble too much in the conspiracy side of things, but I want to note that view exists at least. The reason I asked about microschools specifically is that I'm in Austin. We have the Acton Academy. Now Tim Kennedy has his own version of the Acton Academy with more patriotism built in, let's say. And there's a few of those popping up, and it's a very interesting ecosystem. I actually wasn't thinking about charter schools. My concern with charter schools is that A, they kind of depend on the approval of government itself because you're using government funds. And B, because as you said, they mostly are used in bad neighborhoods as a replacement to the worst of the public schools. It gives the other side the argument that, look, on average, charter schools are much worse than public schools. Why do we have that? Let's just close them down. And so I don't know if they have a future because there's a built-in counter argument to them. And you're depending on the government agreeing to having that thing, but the government has a good counter argument. So do they have a future in your opinion?
I think they do have a future. I think it will always be capped. They have a future to the extent that the public schools need a PR safety valve because the public schools are under such scrutiny right now and their performance has been so abysmal for so long. And basically all they have left to do functionally is lower standards. That's the only way they can deal with what's going on in their own system right now is to eliminate testing and anything else that would in any way, shape, or form hold them accountable for their own resources, basically, for their own tax dollars. So one way that they get held accountable is by providing this safety valve of funding for charter schools. All right, we know you're doing a crappy job, but at least try this. So it's a concession to their own failure, basically, their own inability to perform. So in that regard, I think that there will continue to be charter schools, but they will, or as you rightly suggest, there will always be a cap to them.
All right. So having discussed schools, I want to go to the first element that you talked about, which is faith, family, and community, if I remember correctly. The family part, I can very easily connect to it. I think faith and community is something that has been essentially lost to the vast majority of people, right? And
so with family.
Well, family maybe in some areas, at least, I've been sort of blessed in that area, and I've been just kind of in the mindset of I'm not an expert in this, so I shouldn't innovate. I should just do what my parents did. And they did what their grandparents did, and it sort of works out well for everybody. I think it's the ones who innovate who find themselves in trouble because, well, ultimately experts are the ones who are supposed to innovate. Not everybody can be an expert in this particular thing. But talking about faith and community, I've been personally finding it very hard because, well, I haven't been blessed with faith. Let's put it this way, right? And so going into a faith-based organization, when I don't share the faith, feels a little hypocritical. Finding a community that is not faith-based has been extremely difficult. It seems like, for the most part, all local community organizations peaked in the 1920s, and they have been kind of dying ever since. I think the average age there is substantially higher than mine. If I go to the Lions Club or Freemasons, even though you need to have faith as well, right? But any one of these organizations, they seem to be walking corpses. So where do you find that sort of community outside of faith? Or is there an antidote to lack of faith that can still connect you to a group of faithful?
Well, there's another way to get into faith. And if you consider what the family dinner table does for the family, and consider what the Sabbath day of rest does for families and communities and individuals. The process of secularization throughout the 20th century was largely a process of eliminating those two central meaningful rituals. The media, basically electronic media in particular, tore the family dinner table apart, by and large, and replaced it with talking heads who simply don't give a flying fuck what's happening in your backyard or at your dinner table. The Sabbath day of rest was replaced by a Wall Street spreadsheet culture, basically, when the spreadsheet became the new Mama Lotion. In the repository for all of our dreams, all of our commercial dreams and aspirations, then what that required was a staffing of organizations that could remain open 24/7 every day of the year. So that day, I'm old enough to remember both institutions very well. I was raised at a dinner table by my parents, thankfully. I still eat at a dinner table. But if you stop and think, what's the nexus of the dinner table and the day of rest? They're both spiritual. They are spiritual rituals first and foremost. The dinner table was where the family came together every night, first to pray, and then for sustenance, for physical and emotional and social sustenance. But the primary reason for coming together at the dinner table was to pay homage to a higher power, to God. Same thing on a larger scale with the Sabbath day of rest. Sabbath day of rest brings congregants together, or used to anyway. It's since been replaced by NFL Sunday, but it used to bring people together in order to first and foremost pray, and after that there was social, emotional, and physical sustenance attached to the rituals involved. So the process of secularization was one of removing those two mainstream rituals from our lives. And you asked me what you can do, how can you sort of, if you can't find faith through a frontal assault, maybe the better way to do that is by choosing a ritual that wherein you satisfy a spiritual need. It doesn't have to be Christian or Jewish or Muslim, but you look for rituals that, something that you do on a weekly basis for an hour or 2 hours a week, whatever, that fulfills your spiritual needs first. Oftentimes you'll find that other needs, so you get compound interest from it. You'll also find that there's social components or a physical component, the same way you did with your soccer. When you were a kid and playing soccer, all these things came together, and it was like compound interest. That 2 hours a day of soccer bought you 16 hours of quality, compound, need-fulfilling time, basically.
Right. But now as I think at the family level, okay, dinner table's easy. We do have dinner every single day. We never miss it, right? But as you get to what do you do on the seventh day, it's really hard to get past let's go to a playground. Let's go shopping, right? So you're still staying at the family level, which is substantially better than going to work by yourself. But we tried going to church at some point, and it just feels really weird because we don't believe this stuff, right? And some of the things that we heard are downright odd. Like, I grew up in Israel. Maybe that means I would find it easier to connect to what is being said in a synagogue and not in a church, but then my wife wouldn't because she didn't grow up in Israel. So it felt like an odd experience. Like, somebody should create, if they haven't already, a church experience without a God in it, and then I'm all in. But I don't know how to connect to it if God is the central figure, and I am not quite sure that he exists. How do I square that circle?
I don't know that you could square that circle, at least not overnight. In my second call to action on the quality of life resistance movement, when I talk about reintroducing meaningful rituals in our lives, I talk about doing it gradually. And I have an exercise, one of the 3 tools in the quality of life toolkit on the resistance movement website. And there's a tool called My Ritual Inventory. And what it does basically is it allows you to take an inventory, create a list of all the meaningful rituals in your life, and assign whichever of the 4 basic needs are fulfilled, are satisfied by that ritual. So most people, when they take their initial ritual inventory, when they build this list, are just mortified by the fact that they have so few meaningful rituals in their lives. And again, I define that as any ritual that contributes to one or more of your 4 basic needs: spiritual, social, emotional, or physical. And most people don't have very many meaningful rituals in their lives anymore because so much of our time is spent consuming media or replying to, whatever it is, something that isn't responsive to our 4 basic needs per se. So my ritual inventory, in the act of building that list, what I then ask you to do is to spend 2 minutes with that list every morning, first thing when you first get out of bed. And you take each line item on your list of meaningful rituals, each ritual, you close your eyes for a second and you envision it, you envision the flavors and the textures and the colors and the emotions associated with that ritual. You say thank you, and then you move on to the next one. And the course of doing that, as you move down the list of meaningful rituals, if you have 4 or 5 meaningful rituals in your life, by the time you get to the bottom, you've said what amounts to a secular prayer. When you say thank you, you're thanking somebody. Just a simple word, thank you. I'm either thanking you for having me as a guest today, or I get up in the morning. First thing I do is say my morning prayers, and I thank God, and I thank the universe for all the wondrous things in my life. All the people, all the things, everything in my life that brings me pleasure and joy and fulfillment. I say thank you. Now, I don't always know who the hell I'm thanking. I use the term God in many times for lack of a better term, and that's okay with me. Other people might feel more self-aware, or more circumspect about doing it that way. But that's a very personal thing. But in the act of basically reciting your ritual inventory, you are in fact reciting a secular prayer, and that's a way of backing into it. And then I say, once every 3 months, go take a look at your ritual inventory, and you find out which of your 4 basic needs are not being satisfied by the aggregate sum of your meaningful rituals. And determine to yourself, I'm going to introduce for an hour a week a new ritual that will satisfy that. Maybe it's spiritual, because most people lack spiritual. In 21st century America and Western society, we are spiritual. Everyone's starving for spiritual fulfillment. Everyone that I know is starving in some way, shape, or form, and wishes they felt more connected with the universe, more connected with a higher power, something greater than themselves. So the way to do that is gradually, once every 3 months, find yourself a new ritual, and it could be through a faith-based organization. It could be maybe something that you just introduced at the dinner table right before you start eating. Say, hey, I want us to go around the table. Tell me one thing you're thankful for today.
So the odd thing is I've had this habit since I was a very young child, where when I'm done eating, I say thank you. Not before, like most Americans would, but right when I'm done. And sometimes people look at me and say, wait, you just made the food, you ate it. Who are you thanking exactly? And I'm saying, I don't know. I'm just supposed to thank somebody because I ate good food. Right?
That's right. That's exactly right. Gratitude, in my observation, I'm in my 8th decade now. I'm not as young as I look. In my 8th decade now, and my observation over the years is that gratitude is the great healing engine. It's what makes all other things possible. That's why I start my day by thanking God for all the great things and people in my life. Because I know that unless and until I do that, my table isn't set. That's for me, personally. But there are ways, again, of backing into that through the reintroduction of meaningful ritual on a very gradual basis, because the small steps can reap profound rewards over time. If you introduce a new meaningful ritual into your life that over the course of a year steals 4 hours a week from your stinking, thinking, mindless rituals of your addictions, then your life will change profoundly. Doesn't take much.
All right. Let's try to raise this to a higher level of abstraction. Like, we talked about how we can all better ourselves. And obviously we can't rely on top-down solutions from government, but maybe we can create solutions that affect more people than just us or our families. You have a Substack. Tim Kennedy starts a microschool. I happen to have a small media company with 9 million readers, right? Maybe I can affect their lives for the better somehow. What can we all do to help people so that maybe in the aggregate, we end up helping 8 billion people eventually, but by each of us trying to affect our corner of the world?
Again, I would say in the same regards that if you're dealing with an addiction that you want to moderate your behavior. By the way, moderation versus abstention is statistically a far better way to deal with addiction. Abstention doesn't work very well. It's just another form of extreme behavior. That's why it doesn't work very often. And if it works for you, great. You go with God. But for most people, it doesn't work very well. And most people recover from their addictions or learn to live with their addictions by moderating their behavior, not by eliminating certain behaviors. So in that regard, I think the response to your question is, if you're looking to expand beyond yourself and beyond your family, the next logical step is with your next door neighbors or your neighbors in your community, or with the schools in your community, volunteering, doing work with schools, doing it. I think our tendency, because we have the tools at our disposal to do so, is to reach out to the world right away. And more often than not, that turns out to be an embittering experience, to the extent that the world doesn't always respond the way you want, if it responds at all. So in terms of finding ways to best leverage our own good intent and our own experience, I think a local application is far better, far more productive, and far more realistic than, I've always had, one of the biggest digital myths that I've always had a problem with was the idea that we're somehow equipped to think globally and act locally. And the only guys who are equipped to do that are global multinational corporations or government agencies with that kind of reach and those kinds of resources to be everywhere at once. The rest of us poor schmucks can't hope to do. All we can do is be befuddled and diverted by that kind of call to action, by that imperative.
View of this would be that to the extent that they act locally, it's just arbitrage and it doesn't benefit the local community in any way.
Absolutely. Take a look at how national and international global media treats local media. All local media, the disappearance of local newspapers and local media franchises and advertising opportunities for local merchants, it all happened when all that inventory went to become part of larger online networks. So it's all arbitraged and all bought and sold sight unseen and with no conversations, no human interaction whatsoever. It's all automated. And what it does, it leaves the little guy out in the cold. I'm starting a new business now, just going around and asking retailers and restaurateurs if they'd like me to make them produce a 45 to 60 second promotional video spot, a professional spot at no cost to them. If they like it, give me $60 a month and you can use it anywhere you want. But I'll take care of all the upfront stuff, They can put it on their websites. They can use it as part of their customer relationship management in their emails, however they want. But I'll front all, what it say, it's just opportunity cost for me, because I know how to do that crap. But the idea is I want to provide my local retailers and local business people and merchants with some way basically to reach out that was hitherto unaffordable or inaccessible to them. I think that's a better application of my time than reaching out nationally. As much as it took me a long time to get to where I am with the quality of life resistance movement, to put all that philosophy and all that thought together. And I've been writing about this stuff in some way, shape, or form for the better part of 3 decades now. And that was after I became a digital media pioneer and gave that life away. So, that maybe that's just a function of my age at this point in time, where I just don't have the stomach for that kind of large scale stuff so much anymore. I'd rather focus on what's going on around me and in my own backyard. And I think that my input to the community and my input to the world at large is much better stated and much better applied if I think local and act local all the time.
Just bearing the weight of your last name. If you're Einstein, you have to live up to it.
There is a measure of that. I admit that there's a narcissistic measure of that associated with my entire life. And my dad was a very prominent baseball writer and a great storyteller. And my father's side of the family is like Hollywood comedy royalty. They're all big time producers and comedians and stars. So, I did some stand-up comedy many years ago, and I was good at it, but I just didn't want to live the lifestyle. I figured if I'm going to be a starving artist, I can do that at home. Well, that's why I started writing instead. So yeah, there's a measure of dealing with your own legacy, but that's one of the things I thank God for every morning.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, a real pleasure.
This has been another episode of The Otherweb. Join us next time for more discussions about digital media and other related topics.